I was transcribing tithe records when the planet died. Not fell, not burned, died. The orbital station hummed with its usual mechanical prayer, the grinding of air recyclers, the clicking of cogitator keys, the distant thrum of plasma reactors keeping us alive in the void. I sat in my cubicle on Deck 7, subsection Quaternary, surrounded by stacks of data slates taller than a man. My fingers moved across the input pad with practiced efficiency, logging grain shipments from Tertius Gloriana's northern continent, 12 million bushels of corpse starch wheat, quality grade acceptable transit authorization confirmed. Emperor protects. The Vox channels went silent first. Not the crackle of static, not the whine of interference. Silence, pure and complete, as if someone had severed the universe's throat. I looked up from my slate, a stylus hovering over the approval rune, and felt the wrongness before I understood it. The background chatter that filled every moment of station life, cargo reports, shift rotations, maintenance liturgies, simply stopped. In 43 years of Imperial service, I had never heard true silence aboard a void station. Then Senior Adept Calvinist screamed. His workstation faced the observation port, a narrow slit of armored glass that looked out toward Tertius Gloriana. I saw him stagger backward, his chair toppling, his pale hands clawing at his face as if trying to unsee what his eyes had witnessed. The other clerks rose from their stations, a ripple of confusion spreading through the scriptorium like contamination through clean water. I stood too, my legs moving before my mind could authorize them, and then joined the crowd pressing toward the viewport. The planet was gone. Where Tertius Gloriana should have hung, a gray-green sphere streaked with industrial smog and dotted with the lights of 17 hive cities, there was nothing. Not a debris field, not the expanding fireball of an orbital bombardment, or the telltale radiation signature of viral weaponry. Just void, empty space. Blackness punctuated by stars that had been hidden behind a world of 18 billion souls mere moments ago. Sensor error, someone whispered behind me. I recognized the voice of Adept Secundus Vane, his words thick with desperate rationality. The arrays have malfunctioned. Check the cogitator banks. Perform the rite of percussive maintenance. It's a technical fault. It must be. But I knew it wasn't. I had logged that planet's tithes for 22 years. I knew the weight of its exports, the rhythm of its shipping schedules, the bureaucratic heartbeat of a world woven into the Imperium's vast tapestry. You don't transcribe numbers for 2 decades without developing an instinct for their reality. I had touched Tertius Gloriana through 1,000 manifests, traced its existence through 10,000 data entries. And now, looking at the void where it should have been, I felt that connection snap like a cable under too much strain. The sensor arrays hadn't failed. The instruments were working perfectly. They were reporting exactly what existed, nothing. Senior adepts converged on the cogitator shrine, their augmetic limbs clicking as they interfaced with the machine spirits, demanding answers that wouldn't come. Star charts materialized on projection screens, overlaid with real-time sensor data that should have shown a planet, but didn't. Navigational beacons plotted coordinates for an orbital approach to a world that wasn't there. The tithe records I'd been transcribing minutes ago listed exports from agricultural zones that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. I watched Magos Talvern, our station's most senior tech priest, perform the litany of verification 3 times, his metal fingers dancing across brass keys, his optical implants cycling through light spectrums invisible to baseline human vision. Each time, the result was the same. The sensors were functional. The data was accurate. Tertius Gloriana had stopped existing, and we had witnessed it happen. The taste of recycled air turned to copper in my mouth. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of a workstation, knuckles white against the cold metal. Around me, clerks and adepts frantically cross-referenced archives, pulling up historical records, comparing our readings against Imperial cartography logs decades old. They were looking for proof of error, evidence of malfunction, any rational explanation that would let them sleep tonight without seeing that emptiness behind their eyelids. But I stood at the viewport and stared at the nothing, and I understood with absolute certainty that I had witnessed something the Imperium could never acknowledge. Somewhere in the vast machinery of humanity's dominion, something had reached down and erased an entire world, not conquered it, not destroyed it, but simply removed it from reality, as casually as I might delete an incorrect entry from a ledger. 18 billion souls. Gone. Not dead. Death leaves bodies, wreckage, evidence. These people had simply stopped having ever been there at all. The station's alarm klaxons began to wail, their mechanical shriek drilling into my skull. Red emergency lighting flooded the scriptorium, painting everything the color of dried blood. Through the viewport, I could see the running lights of patrol vessels changing course, converging on the coordinates where a planet should have been, searching for something they would never find. I returned to my cubicle on legs that felt borrowed from a corpse. My data slate still glowed with the half-completed tithe record. 12 million bushels of corpse starch wheat from the northern continent of Tertius Gloriana. Quality grade, acceptable. Emperor protects. I saved the file and logged out. My training overriding the existential horror, clawing at the edges of my sanity. Somewhere in the Administratum's infinite archives, that record would persist. A ghost entry for a ghost world. Numbers recording the harvest of fields that had ceased to exist before the wheat could be shipped. That's when I knew they would come for us. You don't witness the impossible and walk away unchanged. The Imperium has protocols for this, procedures, forms in triplicate for the erasure of inconvenient truths. I was right. They arrived within the hour. The bulkhead slammed shut with the finality of a tomb being sealed. I was still at my workstation when the lockdown began. Stylus frozen above an entry I could no longer bring myself to complete. The sound rolled through Deck 7 like thunder. Massive blast doors dropping into place at every junction. Every corridor, every access point that connected our section to the rest of the station. The deck shuddered with each impact, and I felt it in my bones. We were being contained. The emergency vox crackled to life, spitting a pre-recorded message in High Gothic that smelled of ancient contingency protocols. By order of the station commander, all personnel are confined to current sections until further notice. Maintain your positions. Remain calm. The Emperor protects. The words repeated 3 times, then cut to static that sounded almost like screaming if you listened too carefully. Enforcers arrived within minutes. Stormtroopers in void-sealed carapace armor, their faces hidden behind crimson visors that reflected our frightened expressions back at us. They moved with the mechanical precision of men following orders they didn't question. Hellguns held at low ready, each footfall a promise of violence if we proved uncooperative. Their sergeant, a broad man whose augmetic jaw clicked when he spoke, ordered us away from the viewports and into designated holding positions along the scriptorium's western wall. We complied. What else could we do? They confiscated our data slates first, moved through the room with handheld scanners, extracting every device, every GLU, every shred of evidence that we had witnessed what we'd witnessed. My slate, still displaying that final tithe entry from a world that no longer existed, was pulled from my nerveless fingers by an enforcer who wouldn't meet my eyes. He dropped it into a canvas sack already bulging with confiscated technology. Art then moved to the next clerk without a word. I watched Senior Adept Calvinist try to protest. He was old service, 40 years in the administratum, his scalp tattooed with commendation marks from a dozen efficiency reviews. He stepped forward, raising one age-spotted hand in a gesture of bureaucratic authority that had probably worked for him countless times before. I demand to speak with the station commander, he said, his voice cracking only slightly. There are protocols for data seizure, forms that must be filed. I have clearance level. The enforcer sergeant didn't let him finish. One gauntleted fist to the stomach, precisely calculated to fold him in half without causing permanent damage. Calvinus collapsed, wheezing, and two troopers dragged him back to the wall while the rest of us watched and learned the lesson being taught. We were not colleagues being protected. We were contamination being contained. The purge lasted 6 hours. They scrubbed every cogitator terminal, wiped every data core, burned liturgical oils across the brass keypads while chanting the rite of erasure. Tech priests I'd never seen before emerged from the station's depths, their robes marked with symbols I didn't recognize, their augmetic tools designed for deletion rather than repair. They moved through our archives like executioners, pulling files, cross-referencing access logs, systematically destroying any record that mentioned Tertius Gloriana in the past 48 hours. I realized, watching them work, that they'd done this before. The efficiency was too practiced, the procedures too refined. Somewhere in the Imperium's infinite bureaucracy, there existed a protocol for making planets unmake themselves, and we had triggered it simply by being present when it happened. The inquisitorial delegation arrived on the third day. We knew they were inquisitorial by the way everyone else reacted, the enforcers standing straighter, the tech priests bowing their hooded heads, the station commander himself emerging from whatever bunker he'd been hiding in to kneel before them. 3 figures in crimson robes that seemed to drink the light around them, their faces hidden behind featureless silver masks, their movements accompanied by the soft rustle of parchment seals and the click of rosarious beads. They set up interviews in the station's chapel, a narrow chamber on Deck 3 that smelled of centuries of incense and more recent fear. The pews had been removed, replaced by a single steel chair bolted to the floor beneath a stained glass aquila, whose eyes seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. One by one, we were escorted down by silent enforcers and left alone with our interrogators. I watched my colleagues go and not return to our holding area. Adept Vaughn went first, walking with the false confidence of a man who believed truth would protect him. 6 hours later, his name vanished from the duty roster displayed in our cell. Just gone, as if the administratum had reached back through time and erased his assignment to this station, his posting to this sector, perhaps his birth itself. Junior Scribe Melik went second. She was crying when they took her, makeup running down her cheeks in gray rivulets. I never saw her again. Senior Data Curator Fex went third. Then Logistician Crane. The then Archivist Secundus Vol. One by one, our numbers diminished. The holding cell grew quieter, the remaining clerks speaking in whispers if they spoke at all, each of us wondering what criteria determined who vanished and who remained. My turn came on the fourth day. The walk to the chapel felt longer than it should have been, corridors stretching in my perception, every step bringing me closer to judgment I couldn't understand. The enforcer escort said nothing, his hellgun barrel occasionally brushing against my spine as a reminder of what happened to those who ran. The chapel was colder than I remembered. My breath misted in the air as they sealed the door behind me, leaving me alone with the Inquisitor in the silver mask. I assumed he, like though the voice was filtered through vox distortion that stripped away such certainties, sat behind a desk of black wood that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of petrified mourning. "Sit," he said, and I obeyed. The questions started simple: name, rank, years of service, date of assignment to this station. I answered in the monotone I'd perfected over decades of bureaucratic tedium, reciting facts without inflection, becoming nothing more than a recording servitor made of meat. Then, describe what you saw from the observation port. My throat closed. I could still see it, that absence, that void where 18 billion people had simply stopped existing. But I'd spent 3 days in containment thinking about this moment, rehearsing my answer, stripping it of horror and wonder and every other emotion that might mark me as unreliable. The sensor arrays showed empty space at coordinates previously occupied by Tertius Gloriana, I said, each word carefully measured. No debris field, no radiation signature, just void. And what did you conclude from this observation? The trap was obvious. Too much speculation and I became a liability. Too little and I was lying, and Inquisitors had ways of knowing when you lied. I kept my hands flat on my thighs, willing them not to tremble. That the instruments required verification, Your Grace. That something had occurred beyond my capacity to interpret. That wiser minds than mine would need to determine the truth. The mask tilted slightly, processing my response. In the silence, I heard my own heartbeat, too loud, too fast, it betraying the fear my voice refused to show. "You've served the Administratum for 43 years, he said finally, pulling a file from somewhere I couldn't see. My file. Efficiency marks, acceptable. Loyalty assessments, adequate. No infractions, no deviations. A unremarkable record of unremarkable service. He let that sit between us like a blade. We need unremarkable men for remarkable tasks, he continued. Men who can witness the impossible and process it as mere data. Men who understand that the Imperium's truth is larger than any individual's perception of reality. He slid a data slate across the desk. New orders, freshly generated, sealed with marks I'd never seen before. "You are being reassigned," he said. "You will speak of this to no one. You will file no reports. In all official records, this incident never occurred. Tertius Gloriana remains in full compliance with its tithe obligations. Do you understand?" I understood that I was being given a choice that wasn't really a choice. Accept this truth, or vanish like the others. "Yes, Your Grace," I said, taking the slate with hands that almost didn't shake. They released me 6 hours later, escorting me directly to a transport shuttle bound for the system's edge. Through the viewport, I watched the station recede, and wondered how many other souls aboard it would wake tomorrow with holes in their memory where a planet used to be. I was one of 7 who survived the purge. 7 witnesses out of 43, selected by criteria I would spend years trying to understand. The slate in my lap hummed with encrypted data, routing me toward a destination I couldn't yet decrypt. But I knew. it with the cold certainty of a man who'd been marked by something vast and terrible, that this was not salvation. This was the beginning of my real sentence. The warp journey took 4 months, though time loses meaning when you're traveling through hell. I spent those months in a converted cargo hold with 200 other souls. Reassigned personnel, failed aspirants, penal laborers, being shipped to frontier worlds where their sins could be put to productive use. We slept in hammocks, strung between support beams, ate ration bars that tasted of recycled protein, and institutional despair, and spoke very little. Some passengers prayed constantly, their lips moving in silent litanies to the Emperor. Others simply stared at the bulkheads with the hollow eyes of those who'd stopped expecting better. I did neither. I read my orders. The data slate the Inquisitor had given me unlocked gradually, parceling out information in calculated doses, as if testing my psychological resilience. First came the destination, Scolum Obscura, Processing Facility 17, located on an unnamed moon in a sector designated only as administratively stabilized. Then the assignment, Pedagogical Instructor 3rd Class, responsible for basic education of wards aged 6 to 12 standard years. Children. They were sending me to teach children. It wasn't until the 3rd week of transit that the slate revealed why. The facility processed orphans from what the records called dissolved administrative regions, worlds that had been removed from imperial cartography due to catastrophic compliance failure, not conquered by Xenos, not lost to heresy, simply erased from the ledgers, either their populations scattered or eliminated, their names struck from maps as if they'd never contributed their tithes, never sent their sons to the Imperial Guard, never existed at all. The Scolum was where their children ended up, the ones young enough to be re-educated, remade into proper Imperial citizens, with no memory of homeworlds that no longer officially existed. I vomited into the waste reclamation unit that night, my body rejecting the knowledge my mind was being forced to process. 18 billion souls on Tertius Gloriana, and somewhere among the Imperium's infinite machinery, there were probably children from that world being shipped to facilities just like the one I was being sent to. Orphans who would wake up not knowing why they felt incomplete, why their dreams were haunted by cities whose names had been scraped from their tongues. The other passengers gave me wide berth after that. Vomiting on a warp transit vessel was considered bad luck, a sign that the Immaterium was reaching through the Geller field to touch you. They weren't entirely wrong. We emerged from the warp with the usual violence, reality reasserting itself like a fist through rotten fabric. Every soul aboard feeling that moment of wrongness, as their atoms remembered how to be solid. I pressed my face against a porthole and caught my first glimpse of my new home. The moon hung in space like a gray skull, pockmarked with impact craters and dotted with the dim lights of habitation domes. Behind it, a dying star burned with sickly orange light, its corona flickering like a candle in its final hours. No other planets were visible in the system. Just that moon, that star, and the vast emptiness between them. The Scolum facility sprawled across the largest crater, a complex of rockcrete structures connected by enclosed walkways that looked like metal veins. From orbit, it resembled an autopsy scar, sterile, functional, carved into dead flesh. Shuttlecraft ferried supplies from the orbital platform where we docked, their engines leaving trails of chemical exhaust against the airless void. I was processed through intake with mechanical efficiency. Bioscan, retinal verification, loyalty oath administered by a bored clerk who'd clearly recited the words 10,000 times before. They issued me an instructor's robe, gray fabric that smelled of industrial detergent and previous owners, and assigned me quarters in Hab Block 7, is Sub-Level 3, Room 447. The room was a cell with delusions of adequacy. 3 meters by 4, containing a cot, a desk, a footlocker, and a single shelf for personal effects I didn't possess. The walls were bare rockcrete, marked with scratches, where previous occupants had tried to leave some evidence of their existence. Through the narrow window, reinforced glass thick enough to withstand decompression, I could see the dying star casting its diseased light across the crater floor. Orientation lasted 1 day. The Skolum Commandant, a severe woman whose augmetic eye clicked when she disapproved of something, explained our purpose with the clinical detachment of someone describing waste reclamation procedures. "These children are Imperial assets," she said, and her voice echoing in the briefing chamber where 30 new instructors sat on steel benches. "They have been salvaged from administratively dissolved regions and brought here for reformation. Your task is not to comfort them. Your task is not to befriend them. Your task is to educate them in Imperial Gothic, basic arithmetic, and absolute obedience to the God Emperor's divine will. Those who prove tractable will be assigned to productive roles in the Imperium. Those who do not." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They gave me Class 12 Septimus 43 children between ages 8 and 11, seated in rows of wooden desks in a chamber that had once been a storage depot. The walls still bore stenciled inventory codes. The air recyclers wheezed and rattled, struggling to process the thin atmosphere the facility's life support systems provided. I saw the hollowness in their eyes immediately. These weren't normal orphans, grieving for parents lost to war or plague. These were children whose entire reality had been amputated. They sat with perfect posture, hands folded on their desks, faces blank as servitor masks. When I introduced myself, they responded in unison. "Welcome, instructor. The Emperor protects." The words were correct. The tone was dead. I began with Imperial Gothic, writing the alphabet on a chalkboard that squeaked with each letter. They copied dutifully into their slates, their fingers moving with robotic precision. I taught them numbers, addition, subtraction, the holy equations that kept the Imperium's tithe system functioning. They absorbed it without question. I was processing information like cogitators made of meat. But sometimes I would catch one of them staring at nothing, their lips moving soundlessly, and I knew they were trying to remember, trying to recall the names of streets that no longer existed, the faces of parents who'd been administratively dissolved, along with their home worlds, the taste of air that didn't come from recyclers, and taste of food that hadn't been processed through corpse starch rendering. There was a girl in the third row, small, dark-haired, with eyes the color of storm clouds. Her designation was Ward 12S, 331, but she'd scratched a different name into the underside of her desk where she thought no one would see. Mira. I pretended not to notice, but I saw her trace those letters sometimes when she thought I wasn't watching. For her fingers remembering an identity the Imperium had tried to erase. At night, I would return to my cell and mark the wall beside my cot with a scratch for each dissolved world I found in the facility's intake records. The Skolum processed children from 17 different planets, all marked as administratively dissolved within the past decade, all removed from official cartography. 17 worlds, hundreds of billions of souls, gone, leaving behind only these hollow-eyed children who'd been judged young enough to forget. But they hadn't forgotten. Not really. The knowledge was there, buried deep, surfacing in nightmares that had the Night Watch staff rushing to cells where children screamed about skies falling upward, about stars moving backward, about the moment their world had stopped being real. I began to understand why I'd been sent here. Not as punishment, not as reward, but as preparation. They needed instructors who'd witnessed the impossible, who could stand before children orphaned by causality itself and teach them arithmetic without flinching. They needed men and women who'd been broken just enough to function in the machinery of erasure, but not so broken they'd shatter completely. The other instructors never spoke about it. We passed each other in the corridors, gray robes rustling, and maintained the careful silence of accomplices in a crime we couldn't name. Some had been here for years, decades even, their faces worn smooth by the routine of teaching children to forget. They moved with the dead-eyed efficiency of servitors, performing their duties without question, going through motions that had long ago stopped meaning anything. I counted the scratches on my wall each night before sleeping. 17 worlds, 17 scars in reality, 17 holes where human civilization had existed until someone, somewhere, had decided it was more convenient if they hadn't. And every morning I would return to Class 12 Septimus and teach 43 children the alphabet of a language their parents had spoken on worlds that Imperial records insisted had never existed at all. The dying star outside my window flickered and dimmed day by day, as if even it was being slowly erased from the universe's memory. I wondered how long before it winked out completely, and whether anyone would remember it had ever burned at all. The first inconsistency appeared in the 3rd month, a hidden in a supply requisition form I wasn't supposed to be reviewing. Insomnia had become my constant companion on that gray moon. Most nights I would lie on my cot and count the scratches I'd made on the wall, 17 worlds, 17 wounds in reality, until exhaustion finally dragged me under. But some nights, sleep refused to come at all, and I would wander the Skolem's corridors during the graveyard shift, when only maintenance servitors and Night Watch staff moved through the shadows. That's how I found myself in Archive Chamber 6 at 3 in the morning, surrounded by filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. Each drawer packed with intake records dating back decades. The chamber smelled of old parchment and machine oil, lit by flickering glow globes that cast everything in sickly yellow light. I told myself I was looking for teaching materials, better ways to reach my hollow-eyed students, but that was a lie I didn't believe even as I thought it. I was looking for patterns. The requisition form was wedged between 2 intake files, probably misfiled by a careless clerk years ago. Standard Imperial format, requesting 12,000 units of Juvenat supplements to be shipped to Tertius Gloriana, Skolom District 7, for distribution to wards aged 6 to 12. The date stamp read 847.M41, 2 years after I'd watched that planet stop existing. My hands trembled as I held the parchment. The print was crisp, official, bearing all the correct authorization seals and reference codes. Someone, somewhere in the Administratum's vast machinery, was still processing supply requests for a world that had been erased from reality. Either the bureaucracy hadn't caught up to Tertius Gloriana's deletion, or, and this thought made my stomach clench, the deletion was incomplete, imperfect, leaving phantom requisitions like ghosts haunting a house that had burned down. I started pulling files, carefully at first, then with growing urgency, my fingers dancing across drawer labels, extracting records and spreading them across a reading desk that hadn't been used in Emperor knew how long. Supply manifests, shipping logs, tithe assessments, personnel transfers. Each document carefully filed, meticulously maintained, utterly mundane, and absolutely impossible. I found grain shipments destined for 3 different dissolved worlds. Military recruitment quotas still being assessed against populations that no longer existed. The tithe collections scheduled for planets that weren't on any current imperial maps. The bureaucracy was treating these erased worlds as if they still existed, processing paperwork for ghosts, maintaining the fiction of their continued operation, even as children orphaned by their deletion sat in classrooms learning to forget. The patterns emerged like constellations in a polluted sky. 17 worlds marked as administratively dissolved in the Skolem's intake records. But the supply requisitions, shipping manifests, and tithe assessments told a different story. These worlds were still generating paperwork, still demanding resources, still existing in some parallel bureaucratic reality that ran alongside the official one. I pulled a shipping manifest dated 6 months ago, 300,000 tons of promethium, refined on a world called Kessler's Triumph, designated for delivery to Forge worlds in the Segmentum Obscurus. But Kessler's Triumph was marked as dissolved in 843M41. Its children processed through this very Skolem, its name scratched into my wall alongside 16 others. How do you ship promethium from a planet that doesn't exist? The answer was there in the files, if you knew how to read between the lines. The Administratum wasn't making mistakes. The Administratum was maintaining 2 sets of books, one for public record showing dissolved, erased, non-existent worlds, and another for internal purposes, where those same worlds continued their tithe obligations, continued their production quotas, continued existing in the only way the Imperium truly recognized, as numbers in a ledger. I spent the rest of that night cross-referencing records I had no clearance to access, pulling files from drawers that probably should have been locked. The archive chamber's chronometer ticked away hours I didn't notice, my eyes burning from the strain of reading faded print by failing glow globe light. By the time morning shift bells rang through the facility, I had documented 37 separate instances of paperwork persisting beyond planetary deletion. 37 pieces of evidence that erasure wasn't clean, wasn't complete. That somewhere in the Imperium's infinite machinery, deleted worlds continue their bureaucratic half-life, neither fully existing nor fully gone. I returned the files before anyone noticed my absence, but I couldn't return the knowledge. It sat in my mind like a tumor, growing, metastasizing, connecting to everything I saw. In my classroom, I watched Ward 12S 331, Mira, trace invisible letters on her desk, and I wondered if she was remembering street names from a world that was still shipping grain, according to supply manifests I'd found. When I taught arithmetic, calculating tithe percentages, and production quotas, I thought about planets that weren't supposed to exist anymore, but were somehow still meeting their obligations. The other instructors moved through their routines with practiced indifference, and I began to understand that indifference wasn't ignorance. It was survival. They knew. They'd all discovered the same inconsistencies, found the same phantom paperwork, realized the same terrible truth. And they'd learned to keep teaching, keep functioning, keep their eyes down and their questions unasked. I truly tried to join them in that comfortable numbness, but every night I found myself back in the archive chambers, pulling different files, documenting different inconsistencies, building a mental map of the Imperium's double truth that I had no authorization to possess. I discovered labor requisitions for mining operations on dissolved worlds, tax assessments for hive cities that shouldn't exist, court proceedings adjudicating property disputes on planets that had been administratively erased 5 years prior. The deeper I dug, the more elaborate the contradiction became. It wasn't just that paperwork persisted. It was that the dissolved worlds were still functioning, still operating, is still contributing to the Imperium's vast machine, even as their children were being taught to forget they'd ever had homes. In my hab cell, I started marking more than just world names. I scratched dates, reference codes, shipping manifest numbers, a constellation of evidence that proved deletion was a bureaucratic fiction, a convenient lie told in one set of ledgers, while the truth persisted in another. The wall beside my cot became a map of impossibility, scratches overlapping scratches, code numbers spiraling outward until they looked less like record-keeping and more like the desperate mathematics of madness. Other instructors began avoiding me in the corridors. I caught them watching me with the careful wariness of people who recognize the symptoms of someone asking questions they shouldn't. During meal periods in the common refectory, conversations would die when I approached, then resume in careful, neutral tones about weather patterns and supply shortages, and anything except the obvious truth we were all living inside. Only one person ever spoke to me about it directly. Instructor Vess was an older woman, maybe 60 standard years, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that had seen too much to register surprise anymore. She'd been at the Skolum for 18 years, teaching children to forget for nearly 2 decades. One evening, she sat down across from me in the refectory, while I pushed reconstituted protein around my tray. "You've been spending time in the archives," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the clatter of utensils and low conversations around us. I didn't confirm or deny. I didn't need to. "I did the same thing," she continued, stirring her recaf with mechanical precision. "Years ago, found all the inconsistencies, the phantom requisitions, the impossible shipping manifests, built my own map of contradictions." She sipped her recaf, her expression carefully neutral. "You want to know what I learned?" I nodded, unable to speak. "The Imperium is too vast to be consistent, too large to maintain a single truth across 1,000,000 worlds in 10,000 years. So it doesn't try. It maintains multiple truths, parallel realities, contradictory records, whatever is necessary for the machine to keep functioning. These worlds we teach children to forget, they're dissolved in one truth and operational in another. Both are equally real, both serve the Emperor's purpose." She stood, lifting her tray. She looked down at me with something that might have been pity or might have been warning. "Stop scratching your walls, instructor. Stop building maps of impossibility. You're not discovering a conspiracy. You're discovering how the Imperium actually works, and that knowledge will devour you if you let it." She left me sitting there, her words echoing in my skull like a tolling bell. That night, I returned to my cell and stared at the scratches covering my wall. 17 worlds, 37 inconsistencies, 100 coded references spiraling outward like a prayer written in scar tissue. I thought about taking Vess's advice, about stopping my excavation of impossible truths, about learning the comfortable numbness that let the other instructors sleep at night. Instead, I picked up my stylus and scratched another entry. Requisition Form 7734-Alpha. requesting juvenile supplements for Tertius Gloriana, dated 2 years after deletion. I was counting Ghost World paperwork like prayers to saints who'd stopped listening. And I couldn't stop because stopping meant accepting that reality itself was negotiable. That truth was whatever the administratum decided to write in its ledgers. That those hollow-eyed children in my classroom had lost home worlds that still existed in filing cabinets, even as they'd been erased from memory. Outside my window, the dying star flickered like a candle struggling against a wind I couldn't feel. I wondered how many scratches I'd make before someone noticed, before someone decided I'd discovered too much, before I joined the other instructors who'd asked questions and disappeared, with their names erased from duty rosters as efficiently as planets vanishing from star charts. 38 inconsistencies, 39, 40. I kept counting because counting was the only thing that felt real anymore. He arrived without warning on a supply shuttle that was 3 weeks early and carried no manifest. I was teaching Class 12 Septimus Basic Multiplication, calculating tithe percentages, the mathematics of imperial obligation, when the facility-wide Vox crackled to life. All instructors report to briefing chamber immediately. Classes suspended until further notice. The voice was the commandant's, but stripped of its usual authoritative edge. She sounded afraid. The children remained motionless as I dismissed them, their hollow eyes tracking me as I left. Only Ward 12S 331, Mira, showed any reaction. Her small fingers tracing those invisible letters on her desk one more time before standing. I pretended not to notice as always, and hurried toward the briefing chamber with the strange sensation that something fundamental was about to shift. The auditor stood at the front of the chamber when we arrived, and I knew what he was immediately. Not from his appearance, he was gaunt, pale, dressed in the standard gray robes of the Departamento Munitorum, but from the way the commandant stood 3 paces behind him, her augmetic eye clicking rapidly, her posture radiating subordination. Whatever authority she wielded over this facility meant nothing in this man's presence. He didn't introduce himself, didn't need to. He simply informed us that he would be conducting a routine compliance audit over the next 72 hours, and that we were to continue our duties as normal, while making all records available for his review. His voice was utterly flat, devoid of inflection, as if emotion itself was an inefficiency he'd eliminated from his operating parameters. His eyes, though. His eyes were like counting machines, calculating, assessing, recording everything they saw with mechanical precision. When his gaze passed over me, I felt it like a physical touch. Cold, invasive, cataloging me down to my molecular structure. The audit began immediately. He moved through the facility with methodical efficiency, pulling files from archives, cross-referencing data slates, interviewing staff in brief, surgical conversations that left people shaken even when they'd done nothing wrong. He worked alone, requiring no assistance, to eating and sleeping on a schedule that seemed divorced from human necessity. I tried to avoid him, kept to my classroom, maintained my routine, told myself that I was just another instructor doing his job, nothing worth an auditor's attention. But on the second day, during evening meal period, one of the night watch staff pulled me aside in the corridor. "He's been in Archive Chamber 6 for 8 hours, the man whispered, his face pale. "Reviewing files from your access code. He knows you've been digging." My blood turned to ice water. The scratches on my wall suddenly felt like confessions written in my own flesh. Every file I'd pulled, every inconsistency I documented, Every phantom requisition I'd traced. All of it logged, time-stamped, attributed to my access credentials. I'd been so careful about what I'd discovered. But I'd been careless about the evidence that I'd been discovering it. The summons came on the third morning. A servitor, flesh more than machine, its dead eyes reflecting nothing, delivered a data slate to my quarters. Report to Storage Cell 12, Sub-Level 9, immediately. The auditor requests your presence. Sub-Level 9 was deep in the facility's bowels, where the gray moon's rock pressed close, and the air recyclers labored to maintain pressure. Storage Cell 12 had been converted into a temporary office, a desk, 2 chairs, and a portable cogitator array that hummed with processing power far beyond what our facility normally possessed. The auditor sat behind the desk, surrounded by towers of parchment and data slates. My files, I realized. Every record I'd accessed, printed and organized with obsessive precision. "Sit," he said, and I obeyed. The cell smelled of stale recycled air and something else. Ozone, perhaps from the cogitator arrays, or maybe just the scent of consequences catching up to actions. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You have accessed restricted files 473 times over the past 5 months, he stated, consulting a data slate without looking at me. "Archive materials classified at clearance levels 2 through 7, none of which correspond to your authorization grade. You have documented inconsistencies in supply manifests, shipping logs, tithe assessments, and personnel transfers relating to 17 administratively dissolved regions." Each word landed like a hammer blow. I kept my hands flat on my thighs, willing them not to shake, wondering if this cell would be the last room I ever saw. I started, then stopped, unsure what explanation could possibly suffice. "You were seeking patterns," he finished for me, finally raising his eyes from the slate. Those counting machine eyes, calculating the value of my continued existence. "You witnessed the administrative dissolution of Tertius Gloriana. You survived the quarantine protocols. You were reassigned here and discovered that dissolved worlds persist in Imperial records. You began documenting this persistence, creating an unauthorized database of contradictions." Accurate summary. "Yes," I whispered, because lying seemed pointless. He set down the data slate and leaned back in his chair. For the first time since I'd entered, he looked tired. Not physically exhausted, but worn down by something heavier than fatigue. "Do you know how many worlds exist in the Imperium?" he asked. "Approximately 1 million, according to outdated estimates based on incomplete data," he interrupted. "The actual number fluctuates constantly. Worlds are discovered, conquered, colonized. Worlds are lost to Xenos, consumed by the warp, rendered uninhabitable by war or plague or industrial catastrophe. And sometimes..." He paused, his fingers drumming against the desk in a rhythm that might have been calculation, or might have been nervous habit. "Sometimes worlds are administratively dissolved." He pulled a parchment from one of the stacks, slid it across the desk toward me. A tithe assessment for Tertius Gloriana, dated 8 months after its deletion, demanding grain shipments that couldn't possibly exist. "The Imperium is too vast to maintain consistent truth," he continued, echoing Instructor Vess's words from weeks ago. "Terra is 50,000 light-years from the eastern fringe. Warp travel is unpredictable. Communication is unreliable. The Administratum processes reports that may be decades or centuries out of date. A world can be destroyed, and we may not receive confirmation for 100 years. A planet can stop existing, and its tithe obligations continue accruing because the paperwork hasn't caught up to reality. But Tertius Gloriana, I started, was not destroyed, he finished quietly. It was removed, excised, edited out of causality by technologies the Mechanicus barely understands, and the Administratum desperately tries to control. Do you know why? I shook my head, not trusting my voice. Because sometimes a world becomes more expensive to maintain than to delete. The calculations are complex: strategic value versus resource drain, population loyalty versus heretical contamination, productive capacity versus the risk of contagion spreading to neighboring systems. When the equations balance toward deletion, when it becomes more efficient for the Imperium, if a world simply never existed, then it stops existing. He said it so casually, as if erasing 18 billion souls was merely an accounting decision. Which, I realized with dawning horror, was exactly what it was. The problem, he continued, is that deletion is never complete. The universe resists erasure. Records persist. Memories linger. Children wake up screaming about homes they're not supposed to remember. This and the Administratum continues processing paperwork for ghosts because stopping would require admitting the deletion occurred, which would compromise the entire purpose of the erasure. He retrieved the parchment, filed it back in its stack with mechanical precision. You've stumbled upon the Imperium's most shameful necessity, instructor. Not that we destroy worlds. Destruction is glorious, righteous, purifying. But that we erase them, that we make them unhappen, that we maintain parallel truths, because consistent truth is impossible across 1,000,000 worlds and 10,000 years of history. I sat in silence, processing words that felt like poison seeping into my understanding of reality. Everything I'd been taught about the Imperium, its strength, its unity, its eternal dominion, was built on a foundation of administrative lies and convenient fictions. Why are you telling me this? I finally asked. Because you're being reassigned, he said, producing another data slate from somewhere I couldn't see. Fresh orders, sealed with marks that made my previous assignment look mundane by comparison. The Imperium needs clerks who can process the impossible, who can witness causality being edited and continue functioning, who can maintain the fiction while acknowledging the truth. You've proven capable of holding contradictions without shattering. He slid the slate across the desk. I took it with nerveless fingers. Your new posting is classified. You will speak of this conversation to no one. You will file no reports. In all official records, this audit found no irregularities, and you are being transferred due to routine personnel rotation. Do you understand? Where am I being sent? My voice sounded distant, not quite my own. For the first time, something that might have been sympathy crossed his face. There, and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Closer to the truth, he said. And I'm sorry for that. He stood, indicating the interview was over. As I moved toward the door, he spoke one last time. The scratches on your wall, stop making them. Where you're going, you'll run out of wall space. I left the cell with the slate clutched against my chest like a shield that couldn't protect me from anything. The corridors of the Skolum suddenly felt less real, as if I were walking through a stage set designed to look like a functional facility, but hollow underneath. That night, I stood in my quarters and stared at the wall covered in scratches. 17 worlds, hundreds of inconsistencies, a map of impossible truths that I'd carved into rockcrete, because I needed some way to make sense of witnessing reality being edited. The auditor was right. Where I was going, this wall wouldn't be enough. I packed my few belongings in the footlocker they'd issued me years ago, and I didn't say goodbye to anyone. Didn't look for Instructor Vest to thank her for her warning. Didn't check on Class 12 Septimus one last time. Didn't see if Ward 12S 331 was still tracing her real name on the underside of her desk. I simply left, boarding a shuttle that launched in the dead of night while the dying star cast its diseased light across the gray moon's surface. The slate in my lap hummed with encrypted coordinates, routing me towards something the auditor had called the truth. I wondered if truth was something humans were meant to survive encountering directly, or if we were only designed to process its shadow and call that knowledge. The stars visible through the viewport seemed to flicker as I watched them, and I couldn't tell anymore if that was the warp engines engaging, or if reality itself was becoming negotiable the closer I got to understanding how it was actually maintained. Somewhere behind me, 17 worlds that didn't exist continued generating paperwork. Somewhere ahead of me, the Imperium's shameful necessity was waiting to show me exactly how deep the erasure went. The Emperor protects, we were taught. But nobody mentioned what he protected us from was the truth. The listening station existed in a region of space that wasn't supposed to have anything in it. No habitable worlds, no resource-rich asteroids, no strategic warp routes, just empty void marked crimson on every Imperial map I'd ever seen. A designation that meant navigationally unstable, or astronomically insignificant, or more honestly, don't ask questions about what's here. Station Epsilon Null hung in that emptiness like a steel coffin. A converted ore hauler that had been gutted and refitted for a purpose its original builders never imagined. From the transport shuttle's viewport, it looked diseased. Hull plating patched with mismatched metals, sensor arrays jutting from its superstructure like the compound eyes of an insect, and no external markings identifying it as an Imperial facility. Nothing that would show up on long-range scans or attract attention from passing vessels. We didn't exist, officially, and our job was to listen to things that didn't exist either. The crew numbered 43 souls when I arrived, a number that made my skin crawl with its familiarity. 43 witnesses on the orbital station above Tertius Gloriana reduced to 7. 43 students in Class 12 Septimus, hollow-eyed children learning to forget. Now, 43 listeners on a station dedicated to recording the final moments of worlds being erased. The Emperor's mathematics, I thought. Always 43. Always that specific number of souls deemed necessary to witness the impossible. A station commander Hadris met me at the airlock. A woman in her 50s with void black eyes and augmetic vocal cords that gave her voice a metallic rasp. She didn't welcome me aboard, didn't shake my hand, simply scanned my credentials, nodded once, and said, "You'll be on third shift, monitoring banks 7 through 12. Throne Mechanicum will show you to your station. Don't talk about what you hear. Don't record anything beyond standard logs. Don't try to respond to transmissions. Understand?" I understood that I descended another level deeper into the Imperium's machinery of erasure. Throne Mechanicum. The name felt blasphemous, but that's what they called the monitoring chamber, was a cathedral of brass and copper, filled with banks of Vox receivers and cogitator arrays that hummed with constant processing. 6 monitoring stations, each manned by a listener, wearing heavy augmetic headsets their fingers dancing across input keys as they transcribed transmissions from sectors that officially didn't exist. My station was number 9, wedged between a pale man who never made eye contact and a woman whose hands trembled constantly even when she wasn't typing. Neither acknowledged my arrival. The headset waiting for me at the console looked like an instrument of torture. Steel bands, leather padding stained with years of previous users' sweat, audio pickups that would press directly against my skull. The shift supervisor, a tech priest whose designation was just a string of numbers and clicking binary, connected me to the VoxNet without ceremony. The universe crashed into my ears like a tsunami. Voices, thousands of them, overlapping, distorting, are screaming across impossible distances from worlds in their death throes. I heard languages I didn't recognize, prayers I couldn't understand, desperate pleas for a rescue that would never come. The cacophony was so intense that I ripped the headset off after 3 seconds, my hands shaking, bile rising in my throat. "You adjust," the woman beside me said without looking away from her own transcription. Her voice was dead, emotionless. "Takes about a week before your mind learns to filter it. Until then, you'll want to vomit every shift. Some people never adjust. They get reassigned." She didn't specify what reassigned meant in this context, but I had learned enough about the Imperium's machinery to imagine. I put the headset back on and forced myself to listen. The training was minimal because there wasn't much to train. Listen. Identify the source coordinates if possible. Transcribe anything coherent. File the reports in the archive vaults that occupied 3 entire decks of the station. Don't question what you're hearing. Don't try to understand why. Don't think about the people behind the voices, the worlds collapsing behind the static, the civilizations being edited out of causality while you sit in a steel coffin and take notes. The first coherent transmission I transcribed came from a world designated only as Theta 997 in our logs. A woman's voice, speaking Imperial Gothic with an accent I couldn't place, broadcasting from what sounded like a command center or government building. "This is Planetary Governor Estella Vrain. Final entry. The stars have stopped moving. Our chronometers are running backward. The sun rose in the west this morning and set in the east. Half the population can no longer remember their own names. The rest are trying to remember names for things that no longer have them. We have lost the word for home. We have lost the concept of yesterday. I am recording this while I still remember what recording means. If anyone receives this, know that we existed. Know that we served the Emperor faithfully for 3,000 years. Know that we are being unmade and we don't understand why. The Emperor The transmission cut to static. Not the static of signal loss, but something deeper. A sound like reality itself tearing. Like the fabric of existence being shredded and compressed simultaneously. I transcribed it with trembling hands, filed it in the appropriate database, and tried not to think about Governor Vrain's final words dissolving into nothing. I learned the patterns quickly because I had no choice. The erasure followed a sequence, consistent across dozens of worlds. First, temporal distortions. Chronometers drifting, timestamps becoming unreliable, cause and effect losing their rigid relationship. A transmission would arrive dated 3 days in the future, or 6 months in the past, or bearing timestamps that made no mathematical sense. Then, spatial inconsistencies. Coordinates would fluctuate. A world would report being in one sector, then another. Then coordinates that didn't correspond to any known location in the galaxy. as if the planet were becoming untethered from the fixed points that anchored reality together. Finally, linguistic and conceptual decay. The transmissions would stretch and distort, words losing meaning, grammar collapsing, until what came through wasn't language anymore, but raw phonetic noise. The sound of human consciousness trying to communicate as the substrate that gave meaning to words was being systematically erased. Every shift, I listened to worlds die, not through invasion or plague or orbital bombardment, but through something worse, through being retroactively unmade, history being rewritten to exclude them, reality being edited so that they never happened at all. The other listeners moved through their shifts like servitors, transcribing horrors with mechanical efficiency, filing reports on apocalypses with steady hands. During meal periods in the cramped refectory, we ate in silence, avoiding eye contact. Each of us trapped in private hells built from other people's final words. Only once did someone try to talk about it. A new arrival, younger than me, barely 3 shifts into his assignment. He stood up during evening meal and demanded to know why we weren't doing anything. Why we were just recording these transmissions instead of sending rescue vessels, alerting the Imperial Navy, doing something to save the billions of souls crying out for help. Commander Hadris let him finish, then spoke in her augmetic rasp. We listen because someone needs to bear witness. We record because the administratum requires documentation. We file reports because the machinery of erasure must maintain records of what it erases, even if those records are classified beyond mortal comprehension. We do not respond because these transmissions are not occurring in our present. We are hearing echoes of things that are simultaneously happening now, happened years ago, and will never happen at all. Do you understand? The young listener didn't understand. None of us really did. But he sat down and didn't speak again. And 3 days later his bunk was empty, and his monitoring station was reassigned to someone else. On my 3rd month at Epsilon Null, I intercepted the transmission that broke something fundamental inside me. The coordinates matched Tertius Gloriana. The timestamp was 2 years after its deletion, after I'd watched it vanish from my observation port on the orbital station, after the Inquisition had purged witnesses. After I'd been reassigned and moved through the machinery of erasure like a data slate being filed in progressively deeper archives. A captain's log, male voice, speaking with the clipped efficiency of Imperial Navy training. This is Captain Vero Kelsch of the System Defense Monitor Resolute Dawn. Final report. The stars are moving backward. All navigation is impossible. We've lost contact with the surface. Not signal loss, but something worse. When we scan Tertius Gloriana's coordinates, the sensors show 6 different versions of the planet simultaneously, each one in a different state of existence. One shows the world as it was a century ago. Another shows it 200 years in the future. A third shows empty space. A fourth shows something that might be a planet, but is made of geometries my mind can't process. You see, we are losing the ability to remember what planet means. My crew is forgetting their names, their duties, their reasons for being here. I am recording this log while I still understand what logs are for. Tertius Gloriana is being erased, not forward from this moment, but backward through all of time. It's as if the universe is reaching back through history and removing every instance where this world existed, collapsing all its possible timelines into a single point of non-existence. We are caught in the collapse. We are being unmade along with the planet we were supposed to defend. Tell the people whose relationship to me I can no longer name. Tell them I static, that terrible tearing sound. Then nothing. I sat frozen at my station, headset pressing against my skull. Tears I didn't remember crying drying on my cheeks. A Tertius Gloriana was still transmitting 2 years after its deletion, because erasure didn't happen instantaneously. It propagated backward and forward through time, unmaking worlds across their entire history simultaneously. The planet I'd watched vanish was still vanishing, had always been vanishing, would forever be in the process of being erased from causality. And somewhere in that collapse, Captain Kelsch and his crew were trapped, experiencing deletion from the inside, watching their reality be systematically dismantled until even the concepts necessary to understand what was happening to them ceased to exist. I transcribed the log with mechanical precision, filed it in Archive Vault 17, subsection Theta, where it would be stored alongside thousands of other impossible transmissions from worlds that were and weren't and never had been. Then I went to my quarters, a cell barely larger than the one I'd occupied at the Skolum, and stared at the wall where I'd started making new scratches. Not world names this time, transmission timestamps, evidence that erasure wasn't instantaneous, wasn't clean, wasn't the efficient surgical removal the Administratum pretended it was. It was messy. It was ongoing. And we were listening to it happen across dozens of worlds simultaneously, recording their deaths for archives that would never be opened, bearing witness to horrors we were forbidden to acknowledge. The station's viewports showed only void, empty space, marked crimson on maps. An empty space that contained 43 listeners, processing transmissions from sectors that didn't officially exist. Sometimes I would stand at those viewports during off shifts, staring into the darkness, wondering how many of those distant stars were actually there, versus how many were temporal echoes of worlds being unmade across their entire historical existence. Reality was becoming negotiable. Truth was whatever the Administratum decided to file in which set of ledgers. And I was descending deeper into the machinery that maintained that fiction, one transcribed scream at a time. The Emperor protects, we were taught. But the transmissions I heard every shift told a different story. The Emperor erases, and we are the scribes recording the void left behind. I spent 7 years on Station Epsilon Null, listening to worlds die across time itself. 7 years of transcribing screams from planets that were simultaneously existing, dying, and having never been. 7 years of filing reports on apocalypses that propagated backward through history, erasing civilizations from every moment they'd ever touched reality. Then one morning, during third shift, I intercepted a transmission from coordinates I recognized immediately. The Skolum, the gray moon, the dying star that had flickered outside my window while I taught hollow-eyed children to forget. A child's voice came through my headset, small, frightened, speaking words that made my blood freeze. My name is Mira. I'm saying it now so someone remembers. My name is Mira. I'm from static. That terrible tearing sound. I ripped off the headset, ran to Commander Hadris. I demanded to know if the Skolum was being dissolved, if those children were being erased along with the worlds they'd already been orphaned from. She looked at me with those void black eyes and said, "We are archivists of the impossible. We don't save. We record. Get back to your station." But I didn't. I erased the transmission log, deleted the coordinates, falsified my shift report. Then I walked to the station's shuttle bay, where a supply transport was preparing for departure, and I stowed away in a cargo container bound for anywhere that wasn't there. They'll come for me. I know they will. The Imperium doesn't forgive witnesses who refuse to witness, archivists who won't archive, clerks who stop counting the void. But I heard a child say her name into the darkness. I decided that some truths are worth remembering, even if the universe is being rewritten to forget them. My name is your name here. I served the Administratum for 43 years. I witnessed 17 worlds cease to exist. I taught their orphan children arithmetic while reality was being edited around us. I listened to billions of souls scream across time as they were unmade. And I am recording this testimony now, knowing it will probably be erased along with everything else. But maybe, just maybe, some fragment will persist. Some ghost in the machinery. Some scratch on a wall that the Imperium's erasure can't quite scrub clean. The Emperor protects, but someone needs to remember what he's protecting us from. My name is Mira, and I existed.